Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patriska YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Marcus Vincent, and we're going to do something a little bit different today. A much requested topic is what do you believe, i.e., what do Marcus, Mark, and I believe? And so we're going to address that a little bit today, as it seems to be of interest to you all. But as a bit of a preamble to that, Marcus is going to share a few thoughts about Marcion and perhaps what he considered belief was to really set the scene for us to then introduce where we stand. So, Marcus, why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks very much. Happy to do that and to reply to your requests that you want to know, are we atheists, are we believers, or are we mythicists or whatever? And my view is that we first think about what you might believe, I don't know, but at least what might be one reference point of a belief. And that's certainly what the canonical New Testament gives us as it wants us to believe. And here I think one of the foundational beliefs which are exposed and proposed by the canonical New Testament is that what Christians ought to believe is that they believe in the same God that the Jews believe into. So be it according to the Jewish Bible, one of the many names that is given to the Jewish God, be it Yahweh or the one or Elohim, which is a plural form, but or any of the other names. And we have many different names in the Jewish Bible given to this one God. Now, it all starts already with a question about believing in one God. You know, there is in Deuteronomium and also in Exodus, we have the strong statement, I mean, almost like a creed, that people have to believe in one God. Now, here starts already the big problem. How do we interpret one God? When you go up and down the streets in Manchester or in London, people will give you an answer. If you ask the question, do you believe in one God? And they will say potentially yes or no. If they say yes, if you then ask what is meant by one God, they will say, oh, well, you're not believing in multiple forms of God or different gods or a second God, but we believe in just one God. And that's the standard answer that you will get, I think, in the streets. And probably that's exactly what you also believe. Now, the big question is, of course, when we look into antiquity, and in a reader, for example, like Philo of Alexandria, so who is very close to the Jewish Bible and who has written a book about the numbers of God, the numeries, and he will explain to us that the belief in one God doesn't mean in one God as a number. By the way, he, like most people in antiquity, knew, and even Augustine knew that, and later on people still know about it, that one is not a number. Numbers start with 2. 2, 3, 4, 5, those are numbers. What's the character of a number is that you can divide numbers. So you can divide 2 by 1, and then you have 2, of course. You can divide 6 by 3, and then you have 2. You can divide it by 2, you have 3. Now, 1 you can't divide and you can't multiply. And that's the nature of 1, which is not a number. So it doesn't belong to this world of categories, yeah, where you have space and limits and whatever. So what is 1? Now, big question. If it's not a number, what is it? Philo explains in detail that 1 is, if at all, if it is the principle of numbers. Because without 1, you wouldn't have 2, 3, 4, and 6, and all the rest of it. But now, what's the difference now between the principle and the numbers? Well, the principle has no limit. 2 has limit, because 2 is not 3, and 2 is not 1. but one hasn't got a limit. One is limitless. And here starts our big problem. If one is limitless, how can you say in the street you believe in one God, but not in 1,000 gods? Because one God is not the limit to 2 gods, or to 3 gods, or to 6 or 2,000 gods. One is limitless. So it's not a number. It is exactly the opposite of what you and me and Jack and Mark and anybody else today believes what one is. Now you ask me, what do I believe? If I answered you, I believe in one God, you would hear it the wrong way around. Because you would think, I believe in one God, that is the limit, 2 gods, to 4, to 6, to 1,000 gods. So as if the monotheist were the opposite of the pluralists or of the polytheists, even of the atheist. The believer in one, in the antique sense, in the Jewish sense, if you like, and in the early Christian sense, the believer in one God is not the opposite of the atheist, is not the opposite of a polytheist. He is very different. And you now see the problem that I answered on this question when we were writing, when you asked me the question, do I believe? And I said, we need to have a session about it, because I'm sure when I were to state that I believe like you, or I believe in one God like you, I think we would hear it exactly in the opposite ways. So there's a big problem, and trust me, 99.9% of all believers do not know what they believe. And they claim that they believe in the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition, and that has always been my task as a professor in early Christian studies, and who has done Jewish studies as well, to explain to people that they learn what they don't believe, and that they recognize that what they thought they believe, has very little to do with the tradition they claim they believe into. And I think it's enormously interesting to rediscover what kind of a tradition we're in. Now, this was my preface. What I take from there is that the canonical authors, first of all, believed that what they believe is the kind of a Jewish tradition they stand in and they wanted to remain into. And this tradition had, for a while, at the latest, as far as we can historically know, since the Persian times, so roughly from Alexander the Great, we have a Greek tradition of that Jewish tradition, and hence a Greek translation of the Jewish writings, the Septuagint and a few others, revision of the Septuagint, which were going on still in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And we have Christians who make use of various forms of that Greek tradition of a Jewish tradition. So we have a Greco-Jewish tradition, even we could say a Greco-Jewish and a Greco-Latin Jewish tradition, apart from others, Egyptian, Syriac, or whatever. And Christians want to stay in that kind of tradition. Now, when we come to a very limited time period within the Jewish tradition, particularly with the Maccabees, we have a strong resistance of Jews who do not want to be associated so closely with the Greek forms of worship, where they see the worship of multiple gods, multiple names, and you know it. And they want to remain close to worshipping one single God. And they have the problem that the Jewish writings, of course, have this God also under multiple names. So they concentrate and they say, well, no, we don't want to speak the name at all, so we take that blank, which reflects on the idea that this God is a non-categorical God. He has no place, he has no picture in the temple. And if they were strict, which they aren't, religious people even at the time were rarely strict. So a bit of inconsistency belongs to that. They don't see that their one belief in one God is not in exclusion. So but that's limited. These Maccabees, take that oneness of God is an exclusive denomination. But that's the exception. At the same time, around 40 before Christ and our time of Christ, we have people like Philo, but also others who still have the old traditional Jewish tradition of believing that this God is not a categorical God. So as little as he has a picture, as little he has a number. He is the principle of everything. Hence, he is the principle of 2, of 3, of 6, of 1,000. He isn't everything. And you can name it, the name you give it, it's still him. He's even not him, which is also interesting. He hasn't got a gender, because gendering would be categorizing, would be circling the non-circular, the beyond circle, the omnipotent, the endless. So, given that this is potentially a relation which still need to be worked out, how does the canonical New Testament relate to this type of Maccabean tradition, or is it more a Philonic tradition? If we read John, it's certainly more a Philonic tradition than anything else. But that's something one might want to discuss. But when you think that this Christ, as in John, has a pre-existence, in eternal existence, and if you think that, probably with the exception of Mark, before the longer ending, that this Christ has a resurrection and has also an afterlife, that he comes back at some point. It shows that the intention of the canonical authors is to believe also in a non-categorical God, in a God who can be incarnate, because he can be everything, but also he can live for eternity. So he is not categorical. He can even be within where 2 or 3 people are together. So it's not graspable and hence not limitable. What's the difference to Marcion in this regard? Marcion, I think, is strongly related to this Jewish tradition, and to this Jewish tradition that we have in Philo. And just as Philo also has this limitless idea of a very transcendent God who can be the Shekhinah, who can be the presence in this world, the presence in Moses, in the burning bush, the presence with the people going into exile, the presence in the temple, the presence in whoever the Messiah will be. I think that kind of a transcendent God also is the God that Marcion maintains. Now, here comes one difference. The canonical authors, as some traditions also of Jews, believed that this God had created this world. And they make very little difference because they are not philosophers. And they think that this God simply was the creator, and hence this world is his work. Now, there is Philo, and with him a broad strand of thinkers within Jewish traditions, but also outside Jewish traditions, that we call Platonists. And particularly we call them Middle Platonists. Why? Because Platonism at those times was mixed with a bit of Stoicism, another big school at the time, a bit of Aristotle's ideas, pupil of Plato, and others. And one particular element in that Jewish tradition was, as I just mentioned, that God was regarded as super transcendent, super beyond this world. And for that reason, Philo, for example, reads Genesis 1 and 2 in a slightly different way from many of the non-philosophical Jews. To him, God wasn't the creator of this physical world, not of us as physical beings, but only as spiritual beings. And what he did, and that's why, so his explanation, that's why we have two accounts of creation in Genesis, one in chapter 1 and the other starting in chapter 2, 4b. He says, the first creation, that is God's creation, which is the creation of the cosmos numenos, which is the spiritual cosmos, not a physical. Because he could not even create a physical cosmos. Because with all his might, all his power, the physicality would have been destroyed the second that it was created. Hence, if you like, he needed to limit himself, which is the first kenosis. It's like the incarnation later. It's the first withdrawal of the mighty power. And this, so the explanation by Philo and many other philosophers of the time, is because God showed restraint. And this restraint resulted in using his right hand only, and not his full might. So it's a filtered power, if you like, of God. And with this filtered power, he creates the physical cosmos. And that's what's being recounted in the second story. So he creates man, and he creates a woman, and he creates animals, and he creates whatever. But only using his right hand, to which Philo gives the name, same name as Plato gave it, the Logos. And this is the power which is called the demiurge, the real creator. The creator that engages with matter and even creates matter, organizes it, gets it out. And God has a second hand, which is the left hand. And this is the saving power, because the Logos creates the power, the powers in the world and the matter of the world, so the concrete world, but it would be destroyed in a second if God didn't hold it in his other hand. And that's the saving hand. He also sometimes calls it Sophia or Spirit. And you can see we have already a Trinitarian understanding of a divine who is the creator of this world. And this differentiation between the super transcendent God and a Trinitarian way of a creator, I tell you, in most minds, even in the first, second century, that was muddled up and people didn't see the difference. But most people who were not philosophers simply talked about either the one God who was the creator, or Christians then took it more and more to be the Logos, the Deuteros Theos, the second God, or the Trinitarian God who was the creator, and didn't make that kind of a difference any longer. Here, Marcion sides with Philo, and he still makes that difference. In the heresiological minds like Tertullian, who writes about the Trinity, who tries to understand how the one God can be differentiated and still maintain the narratives of the Jewish writings. So he grapples with that question. But what he implies Marcion to have believed, I think, is grossly not understood and grossly misshaped. Because I think if he had read Marcion with some positive emphasis, he would have seen the link that Marcion had within the Jewish tradition with these older Jewish traditions, which we have in Philo and others. So, my summary here, in the non-canonical, in the Marcionite tradition, we have one Jewish strand, and he takes it further because of the social circumstances that he believes that what the Jewish writings give us is not compatible with the real Jewish belief. It is no longer compatible if you mix up the Trinitarian God or the Messianic God with this transcendent God. So he wants to disentangle that. And he sees in the Christian writings, as he found them in Paul, and as he found them in this gospel or gospel material, he sees that what is said in these writings confirms more the transcendent God on the one side and the dealing with this creation of the demiurge on the other side. And we should not revert ourselves and believe into the demiurge, who is at best the second God, as Justin says. But we have to believe in the real God behind it, because otherwise we don't see. We take the mirror for the image, or we take the image for the reality, because the reality is this transcendent God who is behind everything. Two Jewish traditions, pretty much misunderstood still today by, I guess, mostly everybody. And so we ask ourselves, what do we believe? Now, I believe that this type of, I'm not a Marcionite, I'm not a mythicist, I'm not an atheist, because these are all, I think, 19th, 20th century ideas. What I find appealing is this old Jewish traditional thought that there is a first principle behind everything. And this is one of the reasons why I also work thoroughly as a scholar on Meister Eckhart. Because Meister Eckhart was one of the very few who drew back to these old traditions and understood and also thought about that the type of misleading differentiation that people make has to be overcome. And so he makes a big plea for reverting back to the understanding that believing in one God is not in a numerical God, is not in a God which makes a difference to everything else, a difference to his creation, a difference to the stones and to the ants and to the birds and to the human beings, as if God has to save himself because not powerful enough to be everything. And so he says the most interesting definition, if there is a definition at all, is either that he is nothing. And why can we say he's nothing? Because he's everything. So indistinguishability or indistinctness, as he says, is the best describer of the first principle. Because a principle can only be a principle if he is in everything that he principles. And actually, he cannot even be thought of as a principle, so as one, if he is not the source for a multiplicity. So this divine has to be understood, or this principle has to be understood as the necessary creator of the multiplicity. And that's why I love multiple definitions. That's why I love that Jack thinks differently and believes differently from me, and that you are different from me and I'm different from you, because our differences is the expression that there is one behind everything, but not separate from the variety, but actually the wonderful creativity that ever bangs and big bangs have been creating this universe, maybe a billion big bangs or whatever. But it is that the very first principle is only if there is multiplicity, variety, creativity. That's my belief.
That's really interesting, and lots of context there as well, which I think is really important. As you say, most people don't even know the definition of Platonism or Neoplatonism or any of these terms. They've never heard of Philo. They've never heard of some of the discussions that actually went around. And indeed, I remember the first time I learned about the history of the Jewish people and their difficulty to try and categorize one God that clearly is not just one, and there's complexities around that, and even the names Yahweh, Elohim, whatever. There's problems there, and I think that's fascinating. Before I won't take as long as you, because I think arguably I'm a little bit more of a simple man than you are. In every sense, that's true. I'm a more simple man. I just think that I want to put you on the spot as Alex O'Connor did to Jordan Peterson not all that long ago, and to ask you quickly. I mean, you said you're not a mythicist, and so Jesus did exist, I suppose, in some sense for you. I suppose one question that the viewers might have then is regarding the person of Jesus. Do you think that what the Gospels, and I'm talking canonically here, and include the Evangelion, why not? That's what we do here on Patristica. Do you think what they say about Jesus, or in inverted commas, what Jesus says about himself being divine and rising from the dead, indeed Marcion is the Anastasis Party revival, do you agree with Marcion and his followers there, or the canonical Gospels there, that Jesus was divine or had any form of resurrection? Or is that something we either can't know or is purely a myth that was brought up around this charismatic leader?
To be fair, that's the easiest thing to believe. It is more difficult to believe the kind of historicity. And if I may say, if I may draw on Eckhart again, he says it is more important that Christ is being born back, as he says, to the Divine Father through me, than that he was born by Mary in Bethlehem, if at all. So I think for this type of belief that I subscribe to, all kinds of questions of divinity is the least problematic. I would go even further, and maybe I'll take up Eckhart in this sense also, where he says, I just had read a PhD of one of my students, Sarah, yesterday, which I'm just looking through. Augustine says the same thing. He says, when you look into the Psalm, if I remember rightly, 85, is saying, you are the sons of God. And Augustine, when he uses that, he says, I don't even dare to say it myself, that you are divine. I use the word of the Lord, that you are divine. And he quotes that psalm. And very similarly, Eckhart says, it is you, and he includes the stones and the ants and the birds, that are divine, which is not polytheism, to discard that, yeah, because that is a misunderstanding again. No, it is this form of a divine being which cannot be otherwise than being within those that are created. Even more, I think, it is the belief that everything that is created remains in the divine. And that is very much also present in Plotinus, in Porphyry, in Proclus, in this type of a Greek Platonic tradition. But it is also in a Christian tradition, as we see it in Augustine, although he then makes some cautious notes, because he knows he has a bit overspun this kind of divinity. But it is part of that tradition. Now, the bigger question is, why do we have this historical notion? And that's why I have no doubts from at least the text that we have that there was a historical figure like Jesus, because you can make up quite a lot, but I think it's very difficult to make up this kind of consistent creativity and novelty of the sayings that we have. I would rather discard, let's say, a number of stories that are being worked around those sayings, because I think that's part of all kinds of hagiography, right? That once you have got even if it's a rabbi who has an enormous charism, yeah, like Akiba and name the others, then you build quickly stories around him. I mean, even these stories have been built around some politicians. So I wouldn't see a point to dismiss the historicity. It's like dismissing Eckhart as a historical figure or Plotinus as a historical figure, and you don't have two Plotinuses and you don't have two Eckharts, at least not in the history of humanity. maybe in a different world, but not in this one here. And so I think we don't have a second Jesus, at least not in this cosmos here. We don't have two Philos, for example. Yeah. But we have a lot of people who are building on them and trying to capture. And when you say you're just a simple mind, I'm also a simple mind with regards to those historical figures. And so it is a poor attempt of us trying to understand what of that which has been captured by writings and not by these figures themselves. Plato hasn't written a line. Plotinus hasn't written a line. All great minds don't write. So when I'm writing, believe me, it's not of a great mind. Otherwise, I would be silent or would be teaching just. So writing shows that you are simple-minded. And that's all we can as scholars. We are simple-minded people.
Yeah, yeah. Although I still maintain that I'm more simple than you. So in regards to me, I mean, I only need to be brief. I've mentioned it many times on the podcasts that I've been on before, and indeed it's caused some controversy among commenters, and I've received abuse about it from both sides, from Catholics and Christians all the way through to mythicists and atheists, which shows to me that I'm somewhere balanced in the middle ground, perhaps, who knows. So I was raised as a nominal Catholic, though not really with any commitment to it. And I became a Baptist Christian, believing 5 points of Calvinism, give or take as much as one could at the age of 17. Not that I'd ever read Calvin and the primary sources, but I certainly identified as a Calvinist, even though the institutions were yet to be read. And at the age of 21, when I began my university journey, that's when I decided to become a Catholic based on my reading of the Apostolic Fathers and early Christianity. And it was only during my PhD with Jack and Markus here that the history of the Church Fathers began to crumble slightly around me as I criticized the most beloved Ignatius and indeed some of the other figures like Polycarp and Clement. And it was during this time that I had to really confront what I believed and why, and revise so many of the misconceptions and assumptions that I'd made about the Christian faith that clearly were either taught incorrectly to me maliciously or more likely through negligence and ignorance at other institutions and in churches. I always say we should never attribute to malevolence what can easily be understood as negligence. And indeed, that is largely the case in these institutions. Despite the aggressive nature with which some people attack people with conservative views, whether it be on biblical dating or on Jesus, often these people are not malevolent, working in a big conspiracy to overthrow the world with Christendom, but rather have just been taught in a certain way that they've not been able to see outside of the box of yet. And I was blessed to do that during my master's degree and question so much of what I held. And although it did change a lot of my beliefs, ultimately I remained a Roman Catholic and became even more conservative in some sense in terms of my liturgy and my liturgical practices and my understanding of the Catholic Church. And that's because for me, ultimately, the belief in the church does not rest solely on the scriptures, but rather on conciliar ecclesial church. And it's my belief that from the beginning of the church has always been discussion. And indeed, we see that with Justin and Marcion, that they are people who just talk with each other. They have schools, they chat, not always, I'm sure, with a cordial spirit, but always at the end, as Justin tells us, receiving communion in the same place. Now, eventually, Marcion will go on to lose this battle of orthodoxy. And ultimately, there are always winners and losers in these questions. But for me, it's for the church to decide that, and the church globally to do that. And I think that the Catholic Church remains the one that does that in a conciliar manner. Now, one could make an argument for the Orthodox, and indeed maybe even the Coptics on this subject. But I've chosen to rest in the Catholic Church as it's the one that I am most at home in for a variety of reasons. So ultimately, I remain a Catholic to this day with my wife. We attend Mass every Sunday, indeed, sometimes even daily, and we still work for the church in various different capacities. And that definitely comes with some struggles, namely that in particularly my more traditional circles, there is some questioning about the way that we view Scripture. They become quite disheartened and skeptical about the fact that Marcion may have an earlier New Testament to our current canonical one that's affirmed for the last time at Trent. And ultimately, it's about navigating those questions and talking to people and hopefully engaging with them in the same way that Justin and Marcion did, right? There might come an answer where one person is dismissed in the end and someone else wins, in inverted commas, the battle. But it's about having those conversations and those dialogues in a manner that is helpful and constructive. And indeed, I think that's what we do really well on Patristica. Although we're not making doctrine and dogma for the entirety of the 1.2 billion Roman Catholics in the world, we are discerning and changing our minds and talking about things based on evidence and what we have to go on. And indeed, I think some of those more nuanced conversations can be had in a better manner than they are currently being had. And that doesn't just extend to religion, but maybe to go further into politics and to other subjects as well. And indeed, I think one of the issues that we have is the heresiologists' mentality is becoming more prevalent than ever as we try to other those who disagree with us, rather than to engage them cordially and with respect. And that doesn't mean that all opinions are created equal, and nor does it mean that everyone has the same rights to believe stuff. Indeed, I actually hold quite the opposite, that actually not all opinions are created equal. As my wife tells me all the time, telling her what to do when it comes to cooking Japanese food, I don't have the same opinion as she does, because she knows more than I do, and rightly she tells me off. Similarly, as Markus has just been discussing, one of the problems with engaging particularly fundamentalist evangelicals on the question of biblical studies and Christianity is that they literally don't know the history from whence they come and the origins of the text and the hermeneutical approaches that they should take when dealing with biblical texts. And therefore, I don't think it's controversial to say that their opinions are, in some sense, just worth less, not worthless, but worth less because they lack that understanding. And so it's with that mentality that I wish to enter into conversations with other people, particularly with Markus and Mark, for example, about computational linguistics. It's from that place of humility which I learn what the next step is. And so that's essentially where I'm coming from as a Roman Catholic. So without anything further from Markus, I hope that that's given you a bit of a background about where Markus and I come from, and also the different traditions with which we find ourselves in, but also the ability with which we have to not only share our thoughts with one another and disagree well, but also hopefully something that you can take back to whatever religious background or none that you come from. Just as a final reminder,
maybe just one final thing, a bit of self-propaganda. If you want to read more about my upbringing, although I've packed it into a novel, which is not an autobiography, I've just placed the first chapter of this novel, which is going to appear next year in German first, and then hopefully in English later. But I've done the first chapter in 4 readings from those sub-chapters on YouTube. And you can find them as packed as a small series. The novel is called Letting Go. And as it develops, you will see that a lot of experience that I've made during my life has filtered into that novel, although, as I say, it's not an autobiography.
And I will link to that down in the description, and I've already been advertising it in the Discord. So if you're not a member of the Discord, please come and join us. Again, link in the description for that. I've been listening to the novel while I've been driving, and it's on YouTube. So if you have YouTube Premium, then you can listen to it offline while you're driving. So thank you very much again for joining us. We have some exciting series coming up just to entice you to watch the next episode. Markus and I were just discussing that. So please do go down below, like and subscribe. It helps us out so much you do not understand. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.